1 minute ago. Eddie Murphy, STUNS Courtroom. Why I left Hollywood for good. The 12th day of the trial was expected to proceed, like the rest paperwork formalities, no sudden twists. But what unfolded that morning in the courthouse would turn whispers into headlines and set off a media shockwave. At precisely 9:03 a.m., Eddie Murphy entered the courtroom, not through the main entrance, but a discreet side door reserved for high-profile witnesses. The jury noticed first. Reporters leaned forward. The defendant, Sean Diddy Combs, froze mid-sentence. What was once routine had now become a national moment. Murphy, dressed in a sharp navy suit, moved with deliberate calm. He took the oath, his voice steady. "I've been silent for decades," he began. "But after what I witnessed, I couldn't continue pretending." For those watching from the gallery, and millions more online, it wasn't just testimony. It was a reckoning. Back in 2006, Murphy was riding a professional renaissance. His phone rang. Nonstop major studios were courting him like it was the 80s again. But one night changed everything. A producer called me privately. It wasn't a pitch meeting. It was an invitation. He told the court. The location, a secluded estate in the Hollywood Hills. It sounded like just another party, he continued, but the moment I pulled up, I knew it wasn't. Security was biometric. Phones were confiscated. Guests were handed cards with one cryptic instruction. Be who you really are. The mansion was dimly lit, nearly silent. It felt more like a ritual than a gathering. Inside, Murphy recognized familiar faces. Some actors, he'd worked with some strangers. But everyone was acting unusually restrained, like they were being observed. The tone shifted when he was led down a hallway by the host himself. Diddy approached with a warm smile, but the tone underneath was unmistakably calculated. "Brother, it's about time you came home," he said. Murphy described it as surreal. He wasn't talking about Hollywood. He meant something else. Diddy guided Murphy through the estate, casually pointing to guests. "That guy just funded a $200 million film. That one over there? He's all in now." The bravado was chilling. Then came the moment that silenced the room. Diddy paused in front of a large wooden door. "This is where choices get made," he said. "You want to stay funny and broke, or you want to level up?" Murphy peered through the crack in the door and saw a camera tripod inside. Nothing was hidden. "People walked into that room looking tense," he said. "They walked out looking hollow or elated." Murphy declined entry. "I said I needed air." He smiled and said, "No rush. We're all family here." But outside wasn't escape either. A woman stood at the door with a drink. "Are you through with it yet?" she asked. No one leaves before the experience. The phrase stuck with him, the experience. Murphy returned to the lounge, but everything had changed. "What I saw next," he said, "still haunts me." A group including one well-known action star was taken to a back room. Murphy hesitated to name names, but when pressed, he confirmed one, Dwayne Johnson. Candles flickered. Velvet drapes hung heavy. Silver trays were unveiled. The implication was clear: participation meant advancement. Diddy stood at the head of the table. "Tonight is about potential," he declared. "Greatness doesn't come cheap." A tray was placed in front of Johnson. Murphy recalled his reaction vividly, hesitant, scanning the room, then complying. Applause followed. Then he looked at me. Murphy said, "You ready, preacher boy?" Murphy declined again. Diddy's response: "Then why are you here?" Murphy left the room, not out of fear for himself, but for what he saw happening to others. I told him I was a man of faith, that I wasn't going to sign anything, eat anything, lose my soul for access. That night, he walked out of the inner circle, and the machine began its quiet work. Projects vanished, roles were recast, agencies stopped returning his calls. No one said the word blacklist. They didn't have to, Murphy testified. They just stopped calling. Emails presented in court supported his claim. One studio executive had typed, "Not aligned? Pass." When asked to define that alignment, Murphy looked directly at the jury. It wasn't about art. It was about compliance, about staying in line. The courtroom remained silent for nearly a minute. Murphy's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You don't hear a door slam, just the silence after it closes. And with that part, one of his testimony concluded, not with a bang, but with a sobering stillness that swept across the courtroom like a storm just starting to build. When court resumed after a brief recess, the tension was unmistakable. Even the stenographer paused before beginning to type. The air held weight not of speculation, but of revelation. Eddie Murphy returned to the stand with a quieter energy, but it wasn't retreat. It was precision. What followed was not only testimony, but a dissection of an entire industry's unspoken code. I didn't just walk away from a party, Murphy began. I walked out of something deeper, something constructed behind smiles and camera flashes. A hidden room in Hollywood where silence is currency and humiliation buys loyalty. He spoke of the aftermath, not a storm, but an erosion. Projects he had greenlit were shelved. Roles promised were reassigned. After 7 years of a steady decline, his agency simply stopped answering. There was no termination, Murphy noted. They just ghosted me. His words hit like a quiet hammer. He wasn't bitter. He was documenting. Emails introduced by the prosecution painted the same picture studio execs, referring to him as off-brand or not aligned. One message simply read, he said no when he was supposed to say yes. The courtroom shifted as the weight of that line landed. Murphy continued. That was all it took. One no. Not because I caused harm, but because I wouldn't let it be done to me. And then, with deliberation, he dropped the statement that would echo far beyond the courthouse. There is a list, he said, voice unwavering. Not written, but known. The names you don't criticize, the ones you don't cross. The judge cautioned him. Speculation, she warned. But Murphy was resolute. I'm not speculating, Your Honor. I lived it. He named names. Diddy's on it, Tyler Perry, Oprah. Some enforced it, others simply looked away. The jury stirred, the reporters typed furiously. The courtroom was no longer just observing, it was absorbing. According to Murphy, this list wasn't enforced by contracts, but by whispers. There's no memo that says, ban this actor. But there are dinners. There are calls. There are frost glass meetings where someone says, he's a liability. He described how after the party, his name changed in tone. Producers smiled in meetings, but took no action. Projects died quietly. Even friendships unraveled. One actor, a friend Murphy added, told me I was crossing a line. We haven't spoken since. He didn't name that actor. That's the price, he said. Tell the truth, and you lose your circle. Court allowed Murphy to submit email chains and message logs showing the shift in industry communication after the event. The dates lined up. The silence wasn't an accident. It was strategy. Then came the pivot from professional to personal. Murphy spoke of his private battles, the days he wouldn't leave the house, the mental weight of not just what he'd seen, but of doing nothing while others walked in. I didn't speak because I was afraid, not of violence, of erasure. And I saw what happened to the ones who talked. They weren't canceled. They were erased. His voice cracked once. It was the only moment in nearly 2 hours of testimony where his composure visibly shifted. I kept wondering, he confessed. Should I have pulled someone out with me? The silence was complete. He described his road back not to fame, but to stability. He leaned on his family, on faith, not for publicity, but survival. I stopped asking God why. I started asking when. The prosecution asked why he chose now. Because the walls are finally cracking, Murphy replied. For the first time, I'm not the only one speaking. He referenced the testimony of Cassie Ventura and Monique, each bringing their own history into the courtroom. And then came the shocker, an old voice, made new. A Prince recording? Played, Murphy said. Things he warned about before his death, now people were ready to hear them. He paused. I couldn't sit this one out. Not again. The courtroom listened. Not just heard, listened. Murphy's resolve was clear. If truth means losing work, I'll lose it. But I won't lose myself. And then he said the words that turned an actor's quiet withdrawal into a headline. I'm not here to bring anyone down. I'm here to make sure no one has to be built up by them again. He stood as the judge called another break. Jurors rose with him, not out of obligation, but recognition. This wasn't just about a man who walked away from fame. This was about the price of refusing to bow and finally being heard. The third day of Murphy's testimony didn't begin with theatrics. It began with a microphone check. But what followed pulled the curtain all the way back on an ecosystem carefully built to shield silence and sustain. This isn't just about what happened in that house, Murphy began. It's about how many people helped keep it quiet. He outlined a web of complicity, not through overt threats, but through selective protection. Payments, promises, publicity contracts tied to silence. You think one man blacklists alone? He asked. He had help. He had a whole network. Eyes darted to the defense table. Diddy sat stone-faced, but the room felt like it had tilted. Murphy pointed to the broader ecosystem. This system doesn't run on power. It runs on fear. On people too scared to lose what they've built, even if what they built stands on someone else's silence. He described how loyalty was tested in rooms like the one he escaped. Not loyalty to art, but to hierarchy. I saw good men reduced to gestures. I saw performers become pawns. And all it took was one moment, one compromise. The court admitted further exhibits, logs of meetings, canceled post-incident budgets, suddenly too tight, talent deals inexplicably frozen. The blacklist doesn't announce itself, Murphy continued. It's a smile at a meeting, a handshake that leads nowhere. He added, they don't have to say, you're done. They just stop replying. The emotional core deepened. Murphy recounted nights spent questioning whether it was paranoia or real, whether the silence was coincidence or consequence. Then I saw the pattern, not just with me, with others. He looked directly at the jury. There are people who vanished from this business, not because they lacked talent, but because they lacked compliance. This was a larger indictment than any one man. This was a system critique one whispered in back rooms and feared on studio lots. The prosecution asked whether Murphy had any contact with those still inside. A few, he replied, but most fell away. Some warned me, others just disconnected. He described a conversation with a veteran executive who once championed his work. After the party, that executive never returned a call. Through a mutual friend, Murphy later learned why he didn't pass the test. What test? The one where you say yes when you want to say no. Murphy then turned his attention back to the courtroom itself. This courtroom is the first place I've said all this, and I had to do it under oath, because that's the only way anyone would believe it. The judge granted him leeway to describe the psychological toll, not just from exclusion, but from living in ambiguity. You're not sure if you're paranoid or perceptive. That's how the system survives, through your self-doubt. He added, it's not the rejection that breaks you. It's the silence. It's knowing you were in the room yesterday and forgotten today. He described sending out pitches voicing animated films, taking every side project possible, but watching each effort dissolve. You keep telling yourself it's the market, that maybe it's timing. But the truth, the gate doesn't open for you anymore. Murphy wasn't emotional in these moments. He was clinical, dissecting a structure designed to be invisible. Then he shifted again, this time to reflection. Hollywood doesn't just produce movies, he said. It produces myths. And the biggest myth of all is that talent is what makes you rise. It's not. It's submission. The courtroom didn't gasp. It sat stunned. Murphy continued, they tell you to be authentic, but only if that authenticity serves the system. Say the wrong truth, you're done. When asked by the prosecutor what that meant for young artists, Murphy didn't hesitate. They're taught that silence is strength, that compliance is professionalism. But what they're really learning is how to disappear on cue. He closed the session with a chilling quote from a conversation he once had with a now-deceased colleague. "If you disappear like Kim, it wasn't random." The courtroom paused. The lights felt harsher. No one moved. This was no longer just testimony. It was evidence of architecture, one carefully engineered to protect, project, and punish. And for the first time, that blueprint was being read aloud. As the trial reached its fourth phase, the courtroom had transformed from a place of procedure into a chamber of confrontation. Confrontation, not just between Murphy and the accused, but between truth and reputation, silence and legacy. The prosecution's focus shifted less about what happened in the house, more about what happened after. What happens to a person who says no when everyone else nods? Murphy answered not with theory, but with lived experience. "They didn't need to fire me," he said. "They didn't need to cancel me. They just needed to not call me." The line landed with quiet devastation. Murphy described years of floating meetings that led nowhere, smiles that held no substance, projects that stalled without explanation. He tried everything. Voice work, indie scripts, screenplay submissions, but every move felt like running in place. People smiled in meetings, nodded at pitches, and then vanished, he said. Like I'd become invisible. The defense team attempted to suggest a market-driven decline, aging star, evolving tastes, natural career ebb. Murphy responded with dates, emails, contracts revoked, without reason. He wasn't claiming a fall. He was describing a shutout. "There's no bell that rings," he said, just the absence of sound. Then came the receipts. An internal email presented by the prosecution showed a studio executive writing, "Not aligned, pass." Murphy's name was on the subject line. Another, "He's not one of us anymore." Murphy leaned into the microphone. Hollywood's blacklist doesn't wear a name tag. It shakes your hand while it erases you. He traced how the narrative around him began to change. "I was no longer box office gold," he said. "I was unpredictable. I was difficult. All because I didn't play along." Murphy then pivoted toward the human cost. "I wasn't just tagged for walking away," he said. "I was tagged for not being complicit." He described others, actors, artists who had once walked the same path, only to vanish after crossing invisible lines. "We tell ourselves it's coincidence," he said, "but it's not." Then came one of the most revealing moments of the entire trial. "There is a list," he reiterated. "Everyone in the industry knows it. It's the list of names you don't say out loud. Because if you do," he paused, "you're gone. Diddy, Perry, Oprah." Murphy didn't say their names with venom. He said them with gravity. Some enforced it, he said. Some ignored it. But the result was the same. The prosecution asked if Murphy had ever tried to speak up before this trial. He nodded. "A friend told me, 'You're crossing the line, man. They don't come back for people who cross it.'" The friendship ended. The silence began. Then came the day everything changed. Murphy recalled watching Cassie Ventura take the stand, her voice trembling as she recounted her truth. Then Monique. Then the archival clip of Prince. "That's when it broke in me," Murphy said. "That paralysis. That voice that kept saying, 'Don't speak.' I couldn't ignore it anymore." His voice steadied, not while the floor was still wet. Murphy confessed to feelings of guilt, not for what he did, but for what he didn't do. "I kept wondering, should I have pulled someone out with me? Should I have shouted instead of whispering?" He looked across the courtroom. "I realize now the most dangerous thing I could have done was stay silent." When asked why he hadn't written about it before, Murphy gave a bitter smile. "The people who own the microphones are the same people who own the secrets." Then a pause. "I lost the spotlight," he said. "But I found peace. And honestly, that was the first real role I ever played." Court fell quiet. The prosecutor asked one final question for the day. "Why now, Mr. Murphy? Why speak today?" Murphy took a breath. Because the world is finally listening, he said, and I'm done protecting the pretty lie. As he stepped down, even the defense attorneys couldn't hold their posture. This was no longer just a witness statement. It was a broadcast from behind the velvet curtain, one that could no longer be pulled shut. The final day of Eddie Murphy's testimony arrived without ceremony. No extra security, no press conference, just a silent full courtroom and a man who had already said more than anyone expected. But he wasn't done yet. The prosecution opened gently. Mr. Murphy, in your opinion, what's the most important thing the jury and the public should take from your testimony? Murphy didn't speak immediately. He looked down, exhaled slowly, then faced the room. That Hollywood doesn't run on talent, he said. It runs on submission. You could hear a pen drop. It rewards obedience, not integrity. The moment you stop nodding, the moment you stop pretending you're out. Murphy wasn't bitter. He was resolved. What happened at those gatherings wasn't chaos. It wasn't excess. It was structure. It was a machine. And then the analogy that broke the dam, Diddy didn't build an empire. He built a trap. And too many of us walked into it thinking we were climbing stairs. He paused. We weren't ascending. We were auditioning for silence. The courtroom felt colder. Even the defense table sat still. Murphy turned to the jury. I should have spoken sooner. I should have said no louder. But I'm saying it now because what's done in the dark is coming to light, and you're the first people to see it without blinking. Then came the moment that went viral before the court even adjourned. Don't protect the pretty lie, Murphy said. Let the truth be ugly. He stood. The court rose with him, not by rule, but by reflex. When court resumed, the atmosphere had shifted. The trial was still about the defendant, but the spotlight had turned. Not toward a man seeking revenge, but toward a man who refused to disappear. Murphy had not come to destroy a figure. He had come to expose a formula. The courtroom had become a mirror. As the trial pressed on, the ripple effects began. Old interviews resurfaced. Executives issued quiet apologies. Former insiders began making statements, some anonymously, some defiantly public. It was no longer just about Diddy. It was about everyone who'd sat in those rooms, seen those doors, and chosen either to enter or to look away. Murphy's closing words were simple but thunderous. I'm not doing this to bring him down, he said. I'm doing this so nobody else has to be built up by him again. When asked if he feared the consequences of speaking, Murphy nodded. Of course I do, but I fear silence more. And then the final statement, one that echoed far beyond the walls of any courtroom. This industry taught me to pretend. But this right here, this is the first real role I've ever played. A man finally free of the lie. The prosecutor thanked him. As Eddie Murphy stepped off the stand for the last time, there were no jokes, no applause, just silence. But this time, it wasn't the silence of exclusion. It was the silence that follows truth. And finally, the world was listening.